Two major North American unions are making an appeal to President Donald Trump. They want him to reconsider this latest tariff threat against Canada. Earlier, I spoke to the international president of the United Steelworkers.
Folks are afraid of their livelihoods. We have about 1,500 members who have experienced negative economic consequences. And we want to reverse that, and we want to stem that tide. And so we're very clear that Canada should not face the ire of, the United States when it comes to trade policy, because Canada is our closest friend and ally. We should really be focusing our efforts on bad actors.
Prime Minister Mark Carney says Canada and the U.S. have agreed to intensify trade talks. And according to Ontario's trade rep in Washington, he's seeing it firsthand.
I think the good news here in the embassy in Washington is that it's a beehive of activity. We have all of Canada's best negotiators here. They are very active. They've been here all week. I suspect they will be here all next week. It's really time for us to make progress, and I hope that sitting down and taking on these issues seriously over the next week or so will get us into a better place.
All right, time now for the Power Panel. Cameron Ahmed was head of communications to former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Jamie Ellerton is a former Conservative staffer, and Shannon Proudfoot is a feature writer for the Globe and Mail's Ottawa Bureau. And I just want to get everybody's sense, and Shannon, I'll start with you, on this sense that Carney says they're going to intensify talks. Dominic LeBlanc went down and had what seemed like a pretty short meeting. But as David Patterson says, it seems stuff's still going on behind the scenes. What is your sense of where we're at in terms of these talks?
Cards on the table to start with. I have no idea what's going to happen next, and probably neither do any of us, but let's start from that point.
I would agree with that.
From what David Patterson said, it sounds like things are going on. I sort of have a sense of a two-track thing going on. There is this awkward thing of what Carney can say out loud when people like me pester him in press conferences, knowing that Trump or someone who works for him will be listening. And then there's what's going on behind closed doors. That's maybe a hopeful spin, because I'm assuming there is a different thing going on when they're negotiating, leader to leader, trade rep to trade rep. He's alluded to that. I mean, he said himself, what was it, a month or two ago, in my experience with Trump is there's no deal, and then all of a sudden there is. Yep. There could be a news drop in the next 10 minutes, or maybe next week. We don't know.
I got my phone here ready, just in case.
It could ping, you never know. The erratic nature of that is my sense, that there's what they can say for public consumption, and then there's what they're doing behind the scenes. The question is whether that second track pays off with anything sane anytime soon.
Right. And so, Jamie, like Jameson Greer said on the July 1st deadline for the extension of CUSMA, that, he and his counterpart, in this case Dominic LeBlanc, can talk, and they're talking, and they're making progress, and they're doing things. But at the end of the day, they need to get further instruction from Donald Trump on one side and Mark Carney on the other. And that's where a deal is going to come from. So if there is a flurry of activity in Washington, does it even matter?
I think that's a really good question, Peter. And I think part of the reality of this is so much of what you hear coming from the Trump administration is bluster and bravado designed to do one thing, and that's please Donald Trump. And I think those public-facing communications are often detached from reality and do their best to kind of have a rhetorical flourish and be dramatic and sound like they're standing up for America to do the president's bidding. But I think when you look at where this is going, I do think you are seeing an increasing number of American organizations, you talked about these two unions today, speaking out against these harms of what these are having. There's been talk in the past of putting greater emphasis on the fact that tariffs are actually taxes, and those taxes are being paid for by Americans. And so there's a lot of that kind of what do we do. I think the real fascinating thing for me, the juncture we're at here, if you're looking at kind of the politics of all this, the Prime Minister, I think, has done a very good job of keeping Canadian stakeholders on side, and they believe in what he's doing. Otherwise, they would be speaking out, and he's speaking out a lot and looking to get on this program to drive a message and talk about how the government's failing, whatever that stakeholder group is, whether it's a worker, an industry, et cetera. That's not happening, and so I do think genuinely the Prime Minister has some room to maneuver here, and I think so long as Canadians feel that the Prime Minister is doing the best he can and giving the best that Canadians can get, I think that track is going to continue. I think Canada would be foolish to make a deal just for the sake of making a deal, and I think that's overarching the guiding principle for how this government's been operating.
And Cameron, like I agree with everything these guys have said, and we had a pollster on talking about his Donald Trump's support is really falling apart, and that the unions are coming on them, and all the Sunday talk shows, political shows, have been talking about how how can anybody trust you when every deal you make you go back on, and yet I was down in D.C. for much of the last month. Nobody there is talking about this. This does not resonate. Americans do not care. How do you navigate that?
That's a big question. I mean, firstly, isn't it great when we all agree? I agree with everything Shannon and Jamie said. They're both entirely right. We have a multifaceted approach from the Prime Minister, which involves staying calm and remaining, steady in his negotiation tactics with the Americans, and keeping stability in the Canadian markets and various industries and workers and unions, and managing all the premiers. That's not a small task, but he's doing it really well. At the same time, we have a united cross-Canada approach where we have all politicians, industry leaders, everybody with a voice speaking up, not just to the administration, because it doesn't matter that much what politicians say to the administration publicly. What matters is the messages, to your last point, that make their way to Americans, to American industries, to American workers, to regional politicians, to Republicans across the country. And frankly, it's kind of a mirror of the strategy that we used during the first administration, the first Trump administration. Tons of bluster, tons of drama, constant provocative statements, maintaining as much control and gravitas as we could, but behind the scenes, working every single angle. And that's what we're seeing the government do right now. I think the fact that we have two major unions speaking up is a really strong sign. Whether that makes its way into the Beltway, conversation is another question, and it's kind of hard to imagine it would, given everything else that's happening in American politics right now. But steady as she goes, and as long as the Prime Minister can keep doing what he's doing without reacting to every single provocative statement, that's the best we can ask for right now.
Shannon, I spent the first 10 months of this Trump term telling everybody, look to the first term. And we can see all these parallels. And he introduced tariffs, and then everybody front-ran the tariffs, and then the tariffs started to bite, and then we started to see some movement. We're now 18 months in, and I feel like the parallels are starting to diverge a little bit. Is second-term Trump as different from first-term Trump now as I maybe think he is?
100%.
Yeah.
I think this is a different animal for a lot of reasons. It looks like there's much more emboldened and ready people around him when they took over this time. Like the first time, it was a surprise to them as much as it was to the rest of the world.
And Wilbur Ross was yelling at him not to do things.
Exactly. Remember the first term, it was all about the grown-ups in the room, the people trying to calm things down. That's not the deal this time. I personally would say transparently, Donald Trump himself is in a different place and is reacting differently to things more erratically as the days go by. He's got a lot of irons in the fire right now, a lot of sort of a multi-front war, literally a war. Gas prices, you had someone earlier talking about his approval ratings being in the basement.
They're lower now than they were after the January 6th.
That's astonishing.
Like, it's astonishing.
Yeah,
and yet, I asked the pollster, is this going to move the needle on policy? And she was like, absolutely not.
See, the one place, I wouldn't disagree with a pollster because I lack that expertise, but the one sort of ray of hope or whatever I've always thought is something will change here when it is to Donald Trump's self-interest or the Republican Party's self-interest. And eventually that is going to bite. That is going to be frightening for them, right? They have midterms coming up. Maybe they've written that off because that sure doesn't look good. But they will care about their own self-interest. And the more I see them sort of, it almost reminds me of like pickup artists, like negging someone. Like you see someone in the bar and you want to get their phone number, so you tell them they're not as cute as the friend next to them. Like seriously, it has that feel to me.
It does.
And that is straight from the art of the deal. You make people think you don't want what they have, you don't care, you could walk away at any time. And so in a weird way, the more I hear the Americans talking about how they don't need Canadians and, but maybe we should put their booze back on our shelves, but they don't care anyway, that makes me think there are starting to be some pressure points felt there.
Oh, listen, I agree. And Jamie, I'm increasingly convinced that this period we're in right now, these negotiations leading up to the August 19th potential 50% tariff that breaks the CUSMA compliance strategy that we've had all this time. I feel like this might be so far the most crucial bit. But like, how do we leverage what we have? You know, like the Prime Minister has taken energy exports off the table, which I think is fair. But like Pierre Poilievre spoke today saying that there are other ways of using that. Poilievre agrees that Canada shouldn't threaten an energy boycott, but he says Canada's resources could be used as what he calls positive leverage. Take a listen.
So we say to our American friends, we've got 10 of the 12 NATO-defined minerals needed to fight a war. We've got the minerals needed to fertilize your crops. We've got the 4th biggest oil supply in the world. We can tailor our production and storage of these things for your purchase, particularly in the event of a crisis or a war, if you give us tariff-free access to your country.
Jamie, that's I think an argument that a lot of people in Canada have been making. It hasn't really taken hold, or it hasn't worked. I think the only issue with that is it hasn't worked so far. We're entering into a commodity boom that is going to benefit Canada, and we might as well help the United States. Like, is that an argument that works better the longer this drags on?
I think the argument has merits. I think if you see these 50% tariffs come in, I think the desire amongst Canadians to fight back beyond just taking booze off the shelves of provincial liquor stores will be something that I think pressure on the Prime Minister will grow. I think part of the reason why the Prime Minister has kind of the operating space right now to navigate all this and not overreact to every ounce of bravado that comes out of Washington is Canadians have kind of seen this song and dance before of like things up and scaling, up and down, and the worst case scenario was not realized when those tariffs first came into effect last year. And so I think there's a bit of complacency because they just fundamentally don't understand it. And so I think when you look at the realities of where this is going, if these tariffs do go into effect on August 19th, I think the pressure on the Prime Minister to show that Canada's standing up for itself and to essentially throw a punch back will be great. Does that mean we're going to hold back potash so that the predominantly red state agricultural belt are going to have to feel the heat of what that means to have Canadian potash restricted? Perhaps. You can kind of look at where this is. Of course, when you're looking at anything like this, sometimes it might feel really good in the moment to kind of be a little bit more emotional and tell the counterparty off and feel like you did something. But then the next day, you got to go back to that negotiating table and pick up where you left off and what's that going to be. And so I think there's a weird kind of song and dance between what's happening behind those closed doors that Shannon alluded to that's actually focusing on the real nuts and bolts of a trade agreement, some of it incredibly technical, while the broader rhetorical debate happening is essentially one-sided, like 90-1 if you look at Canadian polls. Like the Prime Minister, the Canadian position is pretty resolute as to what people want to see here, and I think that gives the Prime Minister political cover and political space to let these things play out as opposed to rushing for a bad deal.
Right. Cameron, the risk of escalation is also incredibly high.
Mm-hmm.
Huge. Absolutely. I mean, again, everything that Jamie said is true. The risks are enormous, especially for us. I mean, the risks for the president also exist. And you alluded to that with questions of his poll numbers. I don't think we should take that as an optimistic sign, though, that his poll numbers are low or at a very low point, because unpredictability is the hallmark of how he negotiates and how he governs. So we should not try and draw logical conclusions from how his poll numbers may or may not affect his policy decisions. However, the more that we can get the message across to American stakeholders, especially stakeholders in his broader orbit of Republicans, the business community, the better that we have a chance of getting our messages heard. And to what was just said, the negotiations that happen behind the scenes are almost always about things that don't really rise to the headline level of what we hear the leaders say, right? So that's the work that happens behind the scenes. That's what the Ontario Trade Representative was talking about when he's alluding to, buzzing energy and activity at the embassy in Washington. That's what's happening when our chief trade negotiator and our minister are in Washington meeting with their counterparts. And that's what's happening on the phone, in back channels hopefully every single day, as the Prime Minister says, that trade talks are intensifying. So there's two different types of conversations happening here. They both have to happen. The Prime Minister has to maintain his steady tone while the rest of the team is working behind the scenes, and while we get the message across as broadly as possible across the country in the U.S.
I swore at the beginning of the Shannon that I wasn't going to like parse every sentence and think about what everybody's saying. But like I listened to what Jameson's Greer says.
So much of it turns on psychology,
and it's all these weird little nuance.
Yeah.
And like, so Greer says, you know, there won't be some big global deal. David Patterson said the same thing. Like, are the Lego pieces that Janice Shadat has talked about, is that what we're aiming towards? Is that where we're sort of moving towards, where it's just going to be a bunch of little one-paper side deals?
But you also have Mark Carney saying quite the opposite, saying, I think it was, I can't remember if it was at the First Minister's meeting or an announcement last week, he said, we're not going to have all these little pieces, it's going to be a comprehensive deal, which, to be honest, I sort of paused and thought about it differently today. I've always taken it as sort of like boilerplate when he says comprehensive, but then I thought maybe there's more meaning to that. Maybe what he's trying to not have is what he already has, which is Alberta and Saskatchewan saying, hey, like, let's take oil and gas off the table. We're not doing this. Like, we're fine, because there's not a lot of pain yet for those provinces. It's Ontario and Quebec that are feeling it. So it could be that that's more him trying to marshal the troops and keep them behind him. But you're right, it's impossible not to parse what everyone says and the postures, because so much of this is posturing. And I think what, like, the really tricky position the Prime Minister is in, and my co-panelists are right, so far he's really been given carte blanche in this by Canadians, but I think eventually it's going to get harder, is the difference between what feels emotionally satisfying to Canadians and what is tactical.
That's exactly it.
Like, because he is pulling punches all over the place. And sometimes it doesn't feel great, or he gets called out for it, but you can also understand strategically why he's doing it.
All right. We got to leave it at that. Thank you all. The Power Panel, Cameron Ahmed, Jamie Ellerton, and Shannon Proudfoot.